You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name's Brendan Cole. The British government has defended security services against criticism they missed signs which might have helped prevent the murder of a soldier in London. The UK's security services face a Commons inquiry after it was confirmed the two men arrested over the murder of drummer Lee Rigby were known to MI5. But Communities Secretary Eric Pickles said it was impossible to control everyone all the time. The suspects are known to be Michael Adebolejo and Michael Adebowale. New footage has emerged of the time when they were shot by police, showing the body of the soldier in the middle of the road, surrounded by the suspects. Shortly after the killing, a man thought to be the 28-year-old Mr. Adebolejo was filmed by a passerby, saying he had carried out the attack because British soldiers killed Muslims every day. But the Prime Minister, David Cameron, appealed for calm.
The people who did this were trying to divide us. They should know something like this will only bring us together and make us stronger. Today, our thoughts are with the victim and with his family.
And in another development, defence experts have said that the attack may have been avoided if the government had greater powers to monitor people's internet communications. So what are the security ramifications in the wake of the attack? What will it do to relations between Muslims and society at large? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Professor John Gearson. He's Professor of National Security Studies at King's College London. Also here in the studio is Valentina Soria. She's a terrorism expert at IHS Janes Consulting. Also joining us in the studio is Salim Chaudhary. He's Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy. Professor John Gearson, these men may have been known to security services. What is it that draws somebody to the attention of the security services in the first place?
Well, obviously, following the events of 9/11, the security service started to consider what sort of threat they were facing. There had been an accusation of a slow catch-up, although we now know that the first Al-Qaeda-related plot in the UK was actually in 2000 in Birmingham. They will be looking at intelligence information from foreign agencies, linking to particular groups, the movement of people. In the previous decade, a great deal of information was found from people travelling to Pakistan, but also other areas of conflict. Young British Muslims have been travelling to Iraq, Afghanistan and other parts of the world, and sometimes returning. But also financial transactions, internet and emails, all together help them shape a picture of a fairly complex and wide-ranging group of individuals of interest, as they call them.
But there's quite a big difference between going to Afghanistan or Pakistan and turning up to a rally that may be headed by a Muslim cleric who shouts provocative slogans. Would they be on the radar necessarily? And certainly we saw images revealed in the last couple of days of one of the suspects at one of those rallies.
Yes, and what we don't know at this stage is whether the known to the intelligence services means having been photographed at a rally, shouting slogans and being associated with people who have been found to be connected to active terrorist plots, or does it mean something more significant?
Does it mean that if they are known to security services that they will be monitored in close quarters, for instance?
They certainly won't be monitored in close quarters as individuals. They will be part of groups of people where connections are looked for and triangulations are identified. So in other words, if people start essentially doing things, travelling, speaking to certain people, carrying out unusual financial transactions, various little bits and pieces might place them on a higher level of watch list. But the reality is our security services are in the low thousands, and there's absolutely no way that the 2,000 to 4,000 people that they might be interested in monitoring can be monitored.
So when the Communities Secretary Eric Pickles says that we can't keep our eyes on absolutely everyone, it's not exactly a reassuring message.
Yes, but they have to balance this with the other key objective, which is, as the Prime Minister said, getting on with our lives normally. And that means not monitoring tens of thousands of British citizens to see if they do perhaps tend towards views that might lead them to violence. And so the whole approach has been to target rather than to identify a whole community or even ethnic group, frankly, who should be monitored just in case. I mean, the British have deliberately tried not to go down that route and have tried to keep the contacts to a minimum in terms of the broadening of these security threats and keeping up communication with local community leaders rather than making a whole community feel that they're being surveilled by this new term that we've been using recently. They're under surveillance by the security services. I mean, they're at pains to tell people that they're not. But can I just add that Britain is one of the greatest surveillance societies in Europe because of our CCTV system, which is more extensive than most countries. So to some extent, there is quite a high level of surveillance against crime and antisocial behaviour, not just terrorism.
Does this make the security services look bad?
I can entirely understand why people within the intelligence services feel that this is very unfair, that they're being told not to clamp down on whole communities and to profile people in effect, because there's no evidence these profiles are reliable at the moment. So you shouldn't characterise everybody between a certain age and whether they are supportive of a certain viewpoint as potential threats. And meanwhile, when these things happen, people will say, well, why didn't you make these connections? And unfortunately, in the case of the 7/7 attackers, again, some of those linkages were missed. So one of the individuals was on a higher level of watch list. They then later found that they had met with people who appeared to be actively preparing for some sort of attack, but they were on the outside and they drifted off. And so the security services continued to focus on the other group. And it was their bad luck, you could say, that it was the other people on the fringes who turned out to be the most deadly.
Valentina Soria, the idea that the 7/7 attackers was raised there, that was a coordinated attack. This is something quite different. Does this suggest a change in tactics?
In recent years, we've seen a shift in attack methodology by not just terrorist cells, but in general, extremists, even isolated individuals, willing and keen to take the initiative on their own. So to some extent, there's been a sort of, deliberate shift, somehow supported and recommended by Al-Qaeda affiliates. So, I mean, we've seen, of course, the spectacular attacks of the scale of 9/11, 7/7 and so on, actually organized, very well planned, and possibly even coordinated by command and control structure, if you want to look at that way. But definitely there was, more structured cell underneath that kind of attacks. The tendency in recent years has been towards more like random attacks. I mean, they're not, of course, they are not random. There's always a level of planning, but definitely more rudimentary in the way, that these attacks are actually carried out, because there has been this urge towards, trying to do it by yourself. I mean, there's been a sort of, urge by, for example, one of the most prominent Al-Qaeda affiliates in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and actually trying to, urge followers to attack with whatever they can actually find.
You did write last year that British youths from African communities could become radicalised as Al-Qaeda looks to Africa to build its strength. We know that the two suspects were British-born of Nigerian origin. Do you think that your findings last year fit in, perhaps, with what's happened this week?
With specific reference to this attack, we can't say yet if that was actually, the trend. Maybe not necessarily, because at least we know that at least one of these individuals was actually, born here in the UK, raised, in a Christian family, although he was of Nigerian origin. I don't think, as far as I've been able to pick up so far, that he was actually greatly influenced by what was going on in his country. But there has been somehow even a shift in somehow radicalization in recent years. We've seen, for example, one of the most active groups in Africa, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, Al-Shabaab, active in Somalia, which they've actually started to somehow encourage not just people in neighboring countries, but of course the Somali community also in Europe, and trying to be part of their actually fight in Somalia themselves. So I mean, there's been this shift in radicalization patterns. The issue of whether African people in African communities are actually more vulnerable is actually more complex from this. And it was a way of looking at possible trend in the way some of the groups most active in Africa and mainly associated with not necessarily Al-Qaeda, but at least the Al-Qaeda ideology could possibly turn towards these communities across Europe to gather more support and possibly attract more recruits.
John Gerson, it's too early to tell. Although police haven't confirmed any links between the killers and Nigerian jihadi groups, there is a possibility that they may have been influenced by terrorist rhetoric coming from their homeland. Is that something they'll be looking at now, or is this just too soon to say?
I think it is too soon to say. I mean, what's interesting is the fact that Al-Qaeda seem to be encouraging converts to carry out direct action. We've had this case, it seems. There was a young man called Nicky Riley in Exeter who tried to let off an explosive device in his body in a coffee bar. Let's not forget Robert Reed, the shoe bomber. The question is whether this actually indicates a sophisticated linkage across the world for Al-Qaeda, or does it actually rather show that they are failing in their normal patterns of trying to carry out spectaculars and are left in desperation with using people who, frankly, in many cases, we're told after they're arrested, have a very shallow understanding of Islam, have been radicalized by charismatic individuals, sometimes on the internet alone, but I think there usually are key individuals also involved. And to be frank, their linkages with conflicts in other countries is often quite tenuous.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the Woolwich terror attack. With me in the studio is Salim Chaudhary, Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy, Valentina Soria, a terrorism expert at IHS Janes Consulting, and Professor John Gearson, Professor of National Security Studies at King's College London. Accused of radicalising one of the suspects was Ajim Chaudhary, and I spoke to him, I interviewed him earlier on, and this is what he had to say to me.
The more people see the murder of innocent men, women and children in Afghanistan, the torture of people, for example, in Guantanamo Bay, rendition and all the other things that are happening in the foreign policy, the more angry they become.
Do you condemn what happened yesterday?
I don't think that condemnation or condone really helps, and therefore I'm never in the business of that. What I would say is that if you're going to condemn the killing of innocent men, women and children, then we should start with the biggest aggressors, which is the Americans and the British. They've killed hundreds of thousands of people, and really many people in cold blood, children and women have been slaughtered. And we see even by the drones themselves, over 3,500 civilians have been killed. So, if we're going to start condemning, then really the root cause is the place where you should begin, not with the reaction to it.
Salim Chaudhary, Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy. Chaudhary refused to condemn it there. Neither did he condone it exactly. But I guess we have to accept that there are a small minority of Muslims in Britain who agree with what he says.
I think that is patently the case. But what seems to be happening is that there's a rhetoric going on that being an orthodox mainstream Muslim isn't good enough anymore. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look in the newspapers over the last couple of months, there's been drip feeding and scaremongering in the media about so-called radicalization taking place on university campuses. And a number of mainstream speakers have been called extremists when really, actually, from my experience in personal dealing and also public dealing with them, they are the ones that actually take the youth off the streets and into positive engagement projects. So what we're happy, so this is a very interesting line here, that what we're finding here is that there are certain preachers being labelled as extremists when really, to not simplify it too much, they're the good guys. They're the ones who are actually saying we're British citizens, Britain is our country, Britain is actually a better country to live in than the Muslim countries, therefore why don't we start contributing to them? And what's happening is that once that demonization occurs, people think, they get frustrated. They think it's not good enough anymore. I can't go through the normal democratic, intellectual argument. It isn't good enough. My voice is not being heard.
Are you suggesting that there's a degree of Islamophobia which fuels this, though?
Absolutely, without a doubt. I discuss with people, and when I talk to some of them will say, well, it's just not good enough. You're going to be criticized anyway. So then what happens is that they start to become a fifth column, and that's very dangerous for Muslims and non-Muslims alike.
But you could argue that people like Chaudhary, and he is a controversial figure, there's no doubt about that, although he insists that he hasn't broken any laws in this country, have caused the rise of groups like the EDL, the English Defence League. But the English Defence League have attacked mosques in the last couple of days. This turns into a vicious circle, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and this is why what becomes the problem here is that certain people who have a very dangerous rhetoric, the problem is that they're obviously given media airtime, which you can't really blame the people behind it, because at the end of the day, it is a fascinating story that how can somebody, as you can hear, he's born in Britain, he's actually a lawyer, which is why he stays on the right side of the law. He can actually he's very careful with what he says, and he can say what he wants to say, because he knows that as long as he doesn't say anything unlawful, then nothing's going to happen to him. But the problem here is that he's a self-made scholar. He's not a scholar at all. In fact, his Arabic is extremely poor. He's been shown up on debates, and yet he's only a scholar for a very, very, a handful of individuals, or maybe tens at max.
But I suppose that highlights the fact that his argument, whether you can pick holes in it or not, and certainly the argument of the suspect who was talking to a bystander that with a knife in his hand, it doesn't have to be a watertight argument, does it? It appeals at a very visceral level to a lot of people. And so you could take aspects of what Chaudhary said there, for instance, about British foreign policy, and a lot of people would probably agree with aspects of that. It doesn't have to be a well-argued case.
Well, absolutely not. And what really happens is that's what we're finding. We're finding that the theology is very poor. The actual Islamic understanding behind it is very, very poor. In fact, one of the ways in which they get around that is by declaring all the mainstream scholars as being infidels or apostates, because, for example, they make them out to be colluding with the democratic process or with obeying the law. So they'll say, well, look, they're obeying a law other than the way we understand Islamic law. Therefore, they cannot be Muslims. So therefore, I have to take their place. And so as a result, what's happening is that basic, and let's face it, a lot of people are very angry about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, many Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The fact is that surely it's better to go through the legal and lawful democratic means to try and change this rather than do acts like this, which actually, as you mentioned, will just cause more harm to the Muslim community, and even they should be able to see that.
Is the Muslim community feeling a bit under siege at the moment? There have been attacks against mosques in the last couple of days. How are they feeling? I mean, what are they feeling like?
I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. The siege mentality has actually been felt since September the 11th. I mean, everybody, and you hear this on talk shows, you hear it from Muslim leaders. They say whenever they hear of a terrorist attack, they say, "Oh God, I hope it's not one of us, or somebody purporting to be from our community," because the feeling is that this is just going to lead to a backlash. So yes, there is a siege mentality, but it means that I felt that this time round, I think a lot of the non-Muslim community have actually felt somewhat comforted, I'd say, by the response, because I think the response has been quicker, the response has been more united from the Muslim community this time round. And I think a lot of people are realizing, you know what? We know Muslims aren't like this. This is just a criminal element, which if they weren't Muslims, they'd probably be in a gang killing for drugs. So I think this is something which we need to explore in further detail.
John Gerson, a common denominator there, British foreign policy, British presence in Iraq, Afghanistan. There's a drawdown of troops in Afghanistan. Britain are withdrawn from Iraq. Does a change in British foreign policy, would it make any difference?
I mean, to be frank, I think the British government anyway, and to some extent the American government, are between a rock and a hard place. I have to remind people that this intervention in Afghanistan occurred after just under 3,000 Americans and international citizens were murdered through hijackings of planes being flown to buildings. There was always going to be a reaction by a country attacked in that way. Whether the Western powers and their allies should have stayed in Afghanistan for 10 years trying to rebuild the country through attacking the Taliban and their supporters is a question beyond this discussion. But they chose to do it. Britain and America are not going to stop confronting Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-inspired groups after they withdraw from Afghanistan. And the controversial use of drones by America to prosecute this war is designed to remove the presence of foreign troops from other countries, but their power and influence will still be there up in the sky. So I expect this element will continue to cause anger amongst certain communities. But it also should be remembered that Britain and America are being criticised for not intervening in the appalling civil war in Syria by some of the people who also criticised them for the sins against Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I don't think the government can easily answer their critics. And frankly, the government is the wrong group to send out the messages against these people. David Cameron's not going to convert any radicalised individuals in Britain to away from their doing. And so I think it's correct that it's good to hear the moderate voices as long as they're being listened to by, frankly, the target audience, which is the people who have not been radicalised yet into violence.
But Salim Chaudhary will just find another reason for a sense of grievance, though.
Potentially, if there's a person with a criminal mind, I mean, what you'll find is a person with a criminal mind will look at even religious law and try and find a way of subverting it and subverting its authority as well. I mean, I agree with Professor Gerson. I think he made a very good point here that at the moment, sort of like damned if you do, damned if you don't, as far as Britain and America is concerned.
Valentina, sorry, Britain's security services will be looking at whether or not there are other domestic elements to this, whether there are linked groups within the UK. But are they taking on board the sheer international scope of this?
Again, it's difficult to say at this point. The fact is that the fact that one of these individuals actually apparently tried to travel to Somalia to possibly join Al-Shabaab, so the extremist group fighting in the country, could actually shed light to a more significant link, or if anything, really proving a trend to some extent that we've actually witnessed in the last maybe 2 years of people from across Europe and even in the UK choosing to travel to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab on the ground rather than trying their luck and trying to go to Afghanistan and Pakistan like it used to be before. The trend towards Somalia, Yemen and so on, as I said, has been developing in the last few years because these countries have become the new jihadi theaters. The reason why they choose to go there is actually, again, joining the group, getting training, getting militant experience, and actually acquiring the sort of bravado, because once they get back to their own European countries, they got that kind of personality, higher profile among jihadist circles, and that is really what they actually after.
And John Gerson, it gives them a sense of purpose. I mean, there's been reports that the number of Britons, or people of British origin in Syria involved in the conflict there is at incredibly high levels. Their beef isn't necessarily with Britain. It's a cause that they're fighting for, an Islamic cause that gives them a sense of identity.
Yes, but there's a great deal of concern, I don't know if it's actually valid yet, about potential for what's called blowback, that at a certain point, if the Syrian civil war ends or gets into stalemate, these people may return to Britain and then turn their radical approach to what they see as misdeeds of the British government. It's not so different, actually, from what we saw in the lead-up and following 9/11. The reason why 3/4 of those found to be connected with plots in Britain had a connection to Pakistan was because in that period, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, literally thousands of British Muslims passed through training camps, not to come back to fight against Britain, but to take part in the campaign against Indian control in parts of Kashmir. Now, they then diverted into international terrorism and Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism, but that wasn't the reason for the initial travel. And some would say that was the reason why the security services didn't take it very seriously at the end of the 1990s. Syria could turn out to be a similar case. People who travel to Iraq to fight were doing it potentially with the coalition in mind. Those who've gone to Syria are not.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the Woolwich terror attack in London with Salim Chaudhary, Valentina Soria and Professor John Gerson. Salim Chaudhary, I suppose you could argue that if there is a war on terror, and that's what we're constantly being told that there is, the first rule of war, I suppose, is don't do what your enemy wants. Clearly, they wanted to be filmed. They wanted it to be on the front pages of newspapers.
Absolutely, and this is where the kind of the voyeuristic nature from a cultural aspect that we find with the proliferation of extremely advanced HD recording phones that everyone can get now, and video, pretty gruesome acts such as this. It just goes to show that there's a bigger cultural thing which again goes beyond the scope of this show. But yes, I think the media obviously has to remain impartial, but at the same time they're run as businesses. So the media has to ask themselves some very moral questions here. That by doing this, the person who spoke, you could tell that they had a fairly, obviously born and brought up in this country, had a good command of English, was able to articulate their case pretty clearly, and it's now all over the world. Now the question is that will that now inspire other people? I think that there's a big danger of that, because he seemed to do it in a very cool manner, almost in a very cold, calculated manner, and it's something which sends a shiver down the spine. So the question is that yes, we could actually be irresponsible as a civilization for potential. Maybe we should have actually had some kind of, maybe not a news blackout, but some kind of restriction on how these images were portrayed.
Valentina Soria, do you think there should have been a restriction on how the images were shown, and do you think it will lead to copycat? killings?
The issue of copycat attacks, I mean, there's always this fear, I mean, when attacks like this happen. But I think that the kind of tightening of security and, the extra police personnel on the street this days in London will actually, mitigate that threat. In terms of the, whether or not those images had to be, could have been broadcast or not, it's very difficult to strike the right balance. And if it hasn't been for the media, in any case, on social media, those images would have been available in any case.
John Gerson, what do you think?
Terrorism is the tactic of the weak, not of the strong. The communication strategy, and that's what it is, of the terrorists is to give the impression that the government is losing control, that it can't control events, it can't protect citizens from people. Now, individuals going on television with hands bloodied from trying to remove the head of an off-duty soldier is not going to convert anybody. But that's not the intention. The intention is to give the impression that the government is losing control. I would say as of today, they haven't made that case. And in the past, attempts to control the media with terrorists making the statements failed. And so I think the government may have to accept that the world has changed and these images are going to end up on the internet, even if they're controlled in the media.
But you talk about getting the message out that the government is losing control. I suppose one way that the government would want to regain that control is to clamp down on some kinds of freedoms, and certainly the Communications Data Bill, which got the kibosh because of Nick Clegg's opposition to it not so long ago, could be back on the table.
And I was just going to say that's the other major objective of terrorists. A, to give the impression that the government's losing control. B, to encourage the government into repressive responses to their acts. I think as a policy debate, the Communications Bill is a perfectly reasonable thing to debate, and the levels there. The important thing is not to give the impression, A, of a government that is taking dramatic action in response to these attacks, and B, you don't want to make communities feel that they are being targeted by acts such as attempts to monitor them unreasonably. That said, as a society, we should have an open debate about whether all of us have to accept that some of our transactions, whether it's evading tax or trying to think about terrorist acts, our states will watch what we're doing rather more than they did in the past because the technology exists. That's different to saying we're now going to focus on certain communities with exceptional powers. So when the Prime Minister says we have to live our lives normally, that also means try to keep using existing laws, not introduce new laws quickly.
Salim Chaudhary, I'll give you the final word. Will the Muslim community be able to live normally? What will be their priority from now?
I think the priority is, and I'm actually about to give a Friday sermon in about an hour on this very subject, and the priority is going to be, as the British have always said, keep calm and carry on. We believe that Muslims need to go out more than ever to engage with their neighbours, make sure that the neighbours say that we understand and that they understand that the Muslims cannot be a ghettoised community anymore. We can't be like our parents' generation who for 40, 50 years, some of my parents' friends, I mean, it's shocking that some of them cannot even speak a sentence of English. This is not acceptable anymore. That we're part of Britain. It's my country. It's a country that I love. It's a country that I consider my home. And I think that goes for 99% of the British Muslims that are here. So it's time for us to engage more, to actually do the basic duties that the Prophet Muhammad taught us to do, which is to serve our neighbours, to help the elderly, and do the poor, and do a little less preaching and a little more action, quite a lot more action, I believe.
That's Salim Chaudhary, Head of Public Relations at the Islamic Education and Research Academy. My other guests in the studio, Professor John Gerson, Professor of National Security Studies at King's College London, and Valentina Soria, terrorism expert at IHS Janes Consulting, here on The Voice of Russia in London.